In this second session on Buddhism, we're going to talk about the basic teachings of the Buddha, which are still the foundational teachings of Buddhism today, and then also some of the, a couple of the major branches that you find within Buddhism, or strains that you find within Buddhism. There's a lot of variety in Buddhism. I think a whole lot more diversity than what you find in the monotheistic faiths, but maybe not quite as much diversity as what you find within Hinduism. Most Buddhism will refer to these next two bodies of teaching that we're going to talk about that came from the Buddha. But different schools of Buddhism will follow these more or less rigidly, put emphasis on some parts more than others. Some schools will emphasize one way of approaching these teachings from the Buddha's life, and others will approach another way. So there's still a lot of diversity, but these are foundational, I think, in most of what you'd find in Buddhism. When the Buddha had his enlightenment experience and he preached that Deer Park sermon, the main thing that he introduced people to was something that he came to understand as the Four Noble Truths of life, or the Four Holy Truths of life. And these Four Noble Truths, again, are really the basis of Buddhist teaching. And they kind of explain what we talked about early on, what the human predicament is, and what the means is of transforming from that human predicament into a more satisfied spiritual state. And so these Four Noble Truths, the first one, it seems he probably understood at least to some extent before he had his enlightenment experience. Now, my guess is he understood it in a deeper way after his enlightenment. But the first of the Four Noble Truths is that life is suffering. That if you look at everything in life, if you sum up all the experiences of life, what the Buddha concluded was that there were more experiences of suffering and pain than not. And even in those times that were good times, that there was always this sense that there was something right behind you or just ahead of you that would take away that moment. And so suffering was always there. And one of the things that relates to this idea of suffering in Buddhist philosophy is the idea of change. That life is change. That nothing is permanent. That nothing ever stays the same. And that's suffering. Because you can have a moment where you attain something. And it's like the pinnacle of joy and the pinnacle of happiness. But the Buddhist understanding of life, which may be true, is that it all kind of goes downhill after that. That the best moment is the moment of attainment of something, but after that it starts to wear out, you find out it wasn't always cracked up to be, it rejects you, somebody wrecks it, whatever the case might be, but that there's always change happening. And so you can never cling to any moment of joy or any moment of attainment because it's fleeting. Life, characteristically, according to the Buddhist understanding of things, is suffering. And so that human predicament, that human situation from which people desire change, is a predicament of suffering according to Buddhism. Now, certainly an aspect of that suffering is samsara, as we talked about with Hinduism, that continuous cycle of rebirth. Because the understanding of the Buddha is, and of Buddhist teaching, is that life is suffering. And so what samsara does is we're in this life of suffering, and then we die, but then we have to be reborn into a life of suffering. And we die, and we're reborn into a life of suffering. And so the experience of life is suffering, and samsara forces us to have to experience that over and over and over. And so ultimately, the desire is to be freed, or the goal is to be freed from samsara, from this continuous cycle of rebirth, as an expression of the larger human predicament that life's suffering. Nothing's permanent. Everything changes. You can't hang on to anything. So life is suffering. The second truth that the Buddha came to understand in his enlightenment is that the cause of suffering is desire. Okay, so our problem is suffering, and the cause of the problem, the root of the problem, is desire. Now, if you think about that, how does desire open the door to suffering? Well, you desire something, but you don't get it. That's suffering. You desire something, and someone thinks that they've given it to you, but it's not really what you wanted. That's suffering. You desire something, and you get it, but then you find out it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. That's suffering. You desire something, and you get it, and it wears out. Or as I said earlier, it breaks, it dies, it leaves, it rejects, again, nothing lasts. Everything's dust in the wind. And so if by desiring things, we open up the door for us to suffer. Maybe some of you have operated out of that mindset of desire causes suffering a little bit, or you may know someone who does. I've known some people, I think, operate out of that they never get their hopes up about anything, because what life has shown them is that if you get your hopes up about something, your hopes are always dashed. Well, that's a Buddhist philosophy, that you can get your hopes up about something, you can desire something, but you're never really going to be satisfied. Life, as life is, in its reality, will always let you down. And so the problem, the kind of the path to transformation according to Buddhism is the noble truth number 3, that you've got to get rid of desire. You've got to eliminate desire, because if you can eliminate desire, then you can eliminate suffering. I've heard people that, they've been in a relationship and it ended painfully. And sometimes their response is, I don't ever want to have another relationship again. Well, is it really another relationship that they don't want? No, they don't want the pain that is possible from a relationship. And so if I just shut off desire for a relationship, then I won't have pain anymore. Well, that's basically what the noble truth number 3 says. Shut off desire, eliminate desire, and then you eliminate the problem of suffering, the symptom of suffering that we have in life. And so the 4th noble truth answers probably the question that's begging to be answered. How do you eliminate suffering? And what the Buddha taught was that you eliminate suffering by following the middle path. Or it's also sometimes called the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, because it's kind of an 8 stepping stone sort of path. So the 4 noble truths are that life is suffering. The cause of our suffering is desire. So you need to eliminate suffering. And you eliminate that suffering by following the middle path of Buddhism, the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. So then that's the second body of teaching that you find in the core of Buddhism, is this Eightfold Path or this middle path. Now again, like most bodies of teaching within religion, there are different levels of adherence to this path that you find within different Buddhist schools. There's different Buddhist schools that put a focus on different parts of this path. So there's not really a lot of uniformity about that within Buddhism across the board. But these are the basic ideas as far as how to stay on this path of being freed from suffering, or being freed from being affected by the changing and impermanent nature of life. So you follow this Eightfold Path. And again, the overarching idea of the Eightfold Path is the idea that I think Buddha was pursuing from the beginning, to avoid extremes, to try to find some middle path of moderation, is really the overarching idea of this path. The Buddha, in some of his teaching, which I think actually comes from the Dhammapada, said, don't desire too much money, but don't desire too little money. Find the middle path. Don't desire too many friends, but don't desire too few friends. Find a middle path. Don't desire too much food, but don't desire too little food. Find a middle path. Balance, moderation, avoid extremes. And so as he laid out kind of, I guess, what you could see as the stepping stones of this path. And I don't know that they're stepping stones that are like in a perfect line necessarily, but, you know, kind of this path that moves where a lot of this is going to overlap with each other as people progress in their understanding and of their, I guess, attainment of the different levels of this path. So I'm going to talk through it a little bit. I'm not enlightened in the ways of the middle path, but I'll kind of give you a basic definition as far as what I understand these to be about. The first stepping stone on this Eightfold Path, on this middle path, is to attain right knowledge. Now, again, probably different Buddhist teachers are going to teach that knowledge is different things. Some are going to involve more knowledge than others as far as what you need to have for this path. But I think we can safely say that the core of that knowledge is a knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. And not just a knowledge like you're going to have when you're tested over this material down the line here. You're going to know that the Four Noble Truths are that life is suffering, is caused by desire, you eliminate desire, and you do that by following the Eightfold Path. You're going to know that. But this is more of a knowledge, of an experienced, intimate knowledge of those truths. That you don't just say life is suffering, but that you've really come to grasp the deep knowing. You've experienced that life is suffering. Everything in life is impermanent. Everything changes. You can't cling to anything. Because if you do, there's suffering. And that, you know, through all those truths, that you've really grasped that desire is the cause of this suffering. When I desire something, I open up the possibility for suffering for myself. When I desire something and try to pursue that, I bring suffering into other people's lives. When other people desire things and they try to pursue that, they may bring suffering into my life. That desire is the core of all of the suffering that we deal with. And so we've got to find a way to eliminate it. So it's a deep, intimate, experienced, I believe it through and through knowledge of those truths. And again, there's Buddhist teachers that probably have other knowledge that would be important to attain as well. But I'd say that's the basis of it. The second stepping stone on the path is right purpose. Now, if I have come to know the truth of the Four Noble Truths, then what's my purpose going to be? To eliminate desire. To cling to nothing. To not be attached to anything. Because suffering comes when we do that. And so this right purpose is that, to eliminate desire. To pursue a life of detachment, to pursue a life of not clinging to things. And then the next three stepping stones are kind of outward behavioral ways to begin to eliminate desire or eliminate clinging from our lives or attachment from our lives. And the first of those that the Buddha talks about is to have right speech. You know, there's a lot of teachings from these great teachers of the various religions that sound a lot alike. And, you know, the Buddha taught that what comes from the mouth is an indication of what's in the heart. And some of you that are familiar with the teachings of Jesus know that he said that as well. And so the Buddha said, if you can start being mindful of changing your speech from desiring, clinging, attached speech, if you can begin to change that, then you can begin to change the inside. You can begin to change the heart. And you know, there's a lot that he taught. There's probably a lot that other Buddhist teachers teach about that. There were three aspects of speech that the Buddha particularly focused on. He said, you know, if you can eliminate lying, exaggeration, and criticism from your speech, if your speech is totally devoid of those, then you've probably eliminated a certain amount of desire in your life. I mean, why do we lie? Well, we desire something that the truth won't get us, so we lie. Well, if I get to where I never lie, then there's an area of desire that's not controlling me anymore, that takes me from the truth. Why do we exaggerate? Well, we desire to look better than reality. And so we stretch the story a little bit. So if I get to where I never exaggerate, then again, I've probably eliminated a certain amount of desire. Why do we criticize? Well, I desire to look better than somebody else, or I desire to make somebody else look worse than me. And that desire brings suffering not only on me, but on those other people. And the Buddha said, if you get to where there's not even an inkling of criticism in your speech, then there's again, probably a certain amount of desire that's been eliminated. And, this probably isn't what a Buddhist teacher, I don't know if it would line up with how they would see this. But I kind of picture that it's like you're looking through this tube and you're trying to see reality as it is. But that tube is all gunked up with desire. And so you can't really see reality through the tube. But as you work through these paths, you begin cleaning that stuff out. And you begin getting a clearer vision of the reality that's on the other end of this tube. And so through pursuing this right speech or eliminating wrong speech, then you're getting rid of some of that gunk. Then the fourth stepping stone on the path that the Buddha talked about was right behavior. And this is probably where you find a lot of variation among different Buddhist schools about what that involves. It's typically going to be kind of the ethical code or the moral code of how we should treat other people that's there. It probably sounds a lot like any moral code of any religion, like say the Ten Commandments of Judaism. You don't steal, you don't kill, you don't commit adultery. That all these are things that are motivated by desire. Why do we steal? Why do we kill? Why do we commit adultery? Well, we desire something that we can't have unless we do that. And so we still steal or we kill or we commit adultery. And so this right behavior is about looking at my actions and determining where is desire motivating what I'm doing and changing my behavior. And the idea again is that as we do that, we change the desires on the inside. We get rid of a little more of the gunk in that tube that we're trying to look through to see reality. The fifth stepping stone on this path is right vocation, a right way of making a living. And the basic thrust of this is, again, that our way of making a living should promote life and not harm life. That I shouldn't be making a living in some way that's so desire motivated that I hurt life some other way. I hurt other people, I hurt nature, I hurt animals. Because, again, the Buddhist idea is that we are all one. That's reality. That there's no distinction between me and nature and anything in nature. That we all share this oneness. Again, you're probably familiar with the phrase, it's a Buddhist phrase, to become one with everything. Well, that really is what Buddhism is about, is realizing I am one with everything. But when I let desire motivate me, then I distinguish myself from everything. I claim my individuality, and in so doing, I hurt the harmony of the oneness of nature. And so by the way I make a living, if I really want to follow this path, or someone really wants to follow this path, it's important to choose to make a living in a way that promotes the harmonious balance of nature and of humanity with nature, that doesn't harm life but promote life. I think the vocations that the Buddha particularly was critical of were the vocations of prostitution, slave trading, and I think the third that he criticized was poison peddling, which basically was like door-to-door sales back in his day. But that those were examples where he felt like, where he's taught that only desire motivates those, and they bring suffering into the balance and harmony of life. The last three of the stepping stones on this middle path are more internal. And the first of those, which is number 6, is right effort. And kind of the idea that I get from this idea of right effort is that it's the idea of steady, balanced effort in everything that we do. That we're consistent in what we do. Because if you think about it, desire motivates that roller coaster of inconsistency that we tend to ride, especially inconsistency of effort. I mean, you start out the semester and you desire to do really, really good in your classes. And so you study hard, you take notes, you review your notes. But then lots of the social fun stuff starts happening in life. And so your desire for the academic part wanes. But then you have your first test and it doesn't go so well. So you desire to get your grade back up. And so you put more effort into your classes. But then homecoming comes. And so we ride this roller coaster of desire, whether it's with relationships or jobs or academics, or even in the pursuit of this middle path. And so what the Buddha taught was that when we get to where we have the same steady, consistent effort day in and day out in the things that are within our realm of influence, that we've probably, again, eliminated some of that gunk of desire that's in that tube where we're trying to see reality through. The seventh stepping stone that he talks about is the stone of right mindfulness. Being mindful. And if you study Buddhist philosophy, you'll see that phrase a lot, to be mindful, or to practice mindfulness, or to be attentive. And particularly, a lot of this is about being attentive to your motives, being mindful of your motives. It's kind of the idea of thinking before you speak, or thinking before you act. And of course, what you're thinking is desire motivating this. And how do I alter my intention, or the things I'm about to say, or the things I'm about to do, so that it's not just desire that's motivating it. So being mindful of our behavior, of everything that we do. The idea of being disciplined in our behavior and our speech. Finally, what all this leads to is the ability to have right meditation or right concentration. Again, it's, I'm looking through this tube and I'm trying to see truth. I'm trying to see reality as reality is, unadulterated, not shammed by things, but true reality. And this tube has been all gunked up with all my desire. By the time then you get to this eighth step, hopefully you've cleaned enough of that out that you actually can have a meditative experience where you really do see reality as it is. You're not confused or swayed, or there's not obstacles that are set up because of your desire to see reality as it is. One way that I think about that, and an example I give of that in class usually, and this is probably fitting for you as you're watching this right now, but I always say to students in my class, I look around the room and there might be 45, 48 students sitting there, and I'll say, most of you right now you're looking fairly attentive. Most of you are taking notes. Some of you really are very attentive, and some of you really aren't, and a few of you are checked out. But even for the most attentive of those, while they're in that class experience, there's still other thoughts going on in the back of their minds that have nothing to do with the class. Even as I'm talking right now to you, or as I'm talking to the class, I'm saying this stuff about Buddhism, but there are other things going on in the back of my mind that have nothing to do with Buddhism right now, even as I'm talking about it. And so, that being the case, none of us are ever fully where we are. We're never fully experiencing the reality of the moment because we have all these other thoughts that are pulling at us, distracting us. And if you think about it, those thoughts are desire motivated. How much longer till lunch? Is she going to let us out early? I hope they remember to call me at 12:15 when I get out of class. There's all these other thoughts that are there. I want them to understand what I'm trying to teach them. I'm really hungry. I want to get out of here too. There's these thoughts that are back there that keep us from being fully where we are. And so in this pursuit of trying to see reality as it is, until we get all that cleaned out so that our minds are totally clear of all thought, which is motivated by desire, we cannot really see reality as it is. Buddhist meditation is actually kind of seems a little backwards from how maybe a lot of us think about meditation. I think over time in my life, when I've thought about meditation, I've thought that it's about thinking about something. It's about thinking in a very focused way about something. It's about filling my mind with certain thoughts. But Buddhist meditation is not that. Buddhist meditation is about clearing your mind of all thought that's motivated by desire. And once all that's cleared, you have this clear channel to see things as they really are, and to really see the impermanence of life, to really see that to cling to or be attached to anything in life is futile. Those things are not what's real. And so right meditation is available at that point to see this reality. So the goal, the state that one is trying to reach in Buddhism as a result of their transformation is something called nirvana. So one thing you could say about nirvana and trying to define it is it's the goal of the Buddhist. It's the state that a Buddhist is trying to reach. I think it's easy for us to, as we're casually introduced to Buddhism, to assume, well, it's kind of like heaven. It's a place of peace, kind of like heaven. But I don't, as you look at Buddhist philosophy, I don't know if you could say that really. I don't even know if you could call it a place. And, you know, when the Buddha was asked about nirvana and what nirvana was, he had a lot of answers that were kind of ambiguous, it seems. As a matter of fact, you know, probably the clearest answer about nirvana is that all desire is eliminated, and thus you're freed from suffering. Nirvana apparently was a word that people in that culture were familiar with, and it was a word that was used to describe a candle that had been snuffed out. So you've got a candle there, it's obviously been burning, but it's no longer burning, you'd say nirvana. The flame's extinguished. And so the idea of nirvana in Buddhism is that the flame of desire is extinguished. Nirvana. One of the answers that the Buddha gave, and there's others, but one of the answers that the Buddha gave about nirvana, people were asking him, so is nirvana eternal life? Or is nirvana like annihilation of the soul? Is it existence? Or is it the pursuit of what is it? And the Buddha's answer was, it's both existence and non-existence, and it's neither existence nor non-existence. That's probably about the clearest answer the Buddha gave about what nirvana is. Kind of the way I try to illustrate that to students is a word picture of that if I have a medicine dropper with water in it, and I'm out in the ocean, and you and I are standing beside each other on the deck of the ship, and I lean over the side of the ship, and I drop one drop of water from that dropper into the ocean. And then I turn to you and I say, okay, now, could you go get that drop of water for me? Well, after, you know, you laugh hysterically or cuss me up one side and down the other, or whatever you would do in response to such a request. So we start talking about that. Well, why can't you go get that drop of water? Well, it doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't? It does not, it evaporates. Well, no, it exists. So why can't you get it? Well, because it's a different state. It's a different, you can never go and find, you know, you could go swim in the ocean for the rest of your life and you will never find that drop of water. It becomes part of the whole. And that's kind of the idea of nirvana. You're not going to go to nirvana and be reunited with your grandma in a way that you recognize your grandma. That's not going to happen. Because like that drop of water, you become one with everything. It's the final state of no distinction, but true harmony and unity of all things. And so you're swallowed up into this larger oneness of reality. That, again, in the Buddhist kind of epic story of life was how things probably were at the beginning, whenever that was. All things were one and in harmony and unity, and then something caused us to get divided. And now there's this restoration of that unity. Well, Buddhism, like all the other paths and religions that we talked about, came to places along the way where people disagreed about how it should be practiced. And again, there are many paths in Buddhism, but most of the paths are related to two of the oldest paths of Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. I always say that the Theravada Buddhist would say that they practice their Buddhism like the Buddha did. They practice their Buddhism like the Buddha did. They pursue enlightenment like the Buddha pursued enlightenment. How did the Buddha pursue enlightenment? Well, he had to leave the company of other spiritual pilgrims and go out on his own. And it was on an individual, no assistance journey that he found enlightenment, or that he became enlightened. And so what the Theravada Buddhists teach is that this spiritual journey is very individually oriented. You're on your own. There's no assistance. Of all the religions that we'll talk about in this class, certainly the most atheistic would be Theravada Buddhism. That when you're on the spiritual path, there's no help, spiritual help from other people, but there's also no help from the spiritual realm. There's no God. And you might have noticed so far there's been no mention of God with Buddhism, because in traditional pure Buddhism, God doesn't figure in. That's a separate idea that we hold in ignorance according to Buddhist philosophy, but once enlightened, we'd realize there's not a separate entity from us. Again, we are all one. And so the Theravada Buddhist is on their own. Now, the Theravada Buddhists may live in communities with other monks as they follow this middle path for more pragmatic reasons, but it's not for spiritual help. That's something that they find on their own, just like the Buddha did, that he had to strike out on his own. Within Theravada Buddhism, the person who is a person on that path or a monk on that path is called an arhat or an arahant. You'll find it spelled either way. And again, that's just a monk in Theravada Buddhism, someone who's on their own pursuing enlightenment, pursuing this middle path. Now, Theravada Buddhism was later given kind of a nickname as this second path that I'm going to talk about developed. And that nickname that was given to Theravada Buddhism was Hinayana. And what Hinayana means is small vehicle, or small raft, or small boat. I mean, if you're on this path by yourself, you don't need a big boat. You don't need a big vehicle. It's just you. This stands in contrast to this other path, the path of Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana means big boat, or big raft, or big vehicle. And so the idea of Mahayana Buddhism is that it's community-focused, that you're on this path, you're in this pursuit with others, with assistance from others. And what the Mahayana Buddhists would say is that they practice their Buddhism like the Buddha did. Say the same thing the Theravada Buddhists do. But they look at a different aspect of the Buddha's life. Because once the Buddha was enlightened, then he moved within communities. And when other people came to him and they wanted to be a part of this path, a part of this movement, he encouraged them to be a part of a community, a sangha of monks or eventually of nuns. And so Mahayana Buddhism says we help each other. We come together and we help each other as people on this path. We pray to the souls of others out there to help us, to souls of the Buddhas that are still available to us. Still not really a God concept in Mahayana Buddhism, but certainly prayer is a significant part of Mahayana Buddhism, of praying into the spiritual realm for spiritual help on this path. A teacher in Mahayana Buddhism is called a bodhisattva. And again, this is it's someone who's attained enlightenment, and so now they're teaching others how to attain that. But the other thing that's a unique feature of a bodhisattva is that a bodhisattva is someone who performs like this ultimate sacrificial act of compassion, of selflessness. Because it's believed that what a bodhisattva will do is, even though they've attained enlightenment, And so once they've attained enlightenment in this life, they no longer have to be reborn into this life. When they die, when they're finally freed from this body, the last thing that holds them back, they've attained nirvana. They don't have to be reborn. But a bodhisattva will deny themselves that entrance into nirvana and enter back into samsara so they can, in successive lifetimes, teach more people how to follow this middle path. It's a big boat, and they're trying to get all the people they can into the boat. And so a bodhisattva denies himself nirvana in order to come back and teach others. Probably the most famous bodhisattva is the Dalai Lama of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, Tibetan Buddhism is one of the oldest forms of Mahayana Buddhism that's still practiced today, although threatened because of its situation with China. But the Dalai Lama is the spiritual and political leader of Tibetan Buddhism, and he is a bodhisattva. The understanding is that when he dies, his mind will be reincarnated into a young boy. And so there's a major process that close affiliates of the current Dalai Lama will work through, including prayer and mystical experiences, by which they will come to be able to identify who the next Dalai Lama is. Another type of Mahayana Buddhism that is popular here in the West especially is Zen Buddhism. And as a matter of fact, if you've encountered Buddhism in your world, it's likely it was some form of Zen, and there's all kinds of different Zen schools. But Zen Buddhism is a form of Mahayana Buddhism that focuses on meditation. And the idea is that this meditation, this clearing the mind of all thought on a regular basis, actually gives you a greater freedom and energy to really live freely in this life, to have more healthy relationships, because you're not cluttered up with jealousy and envy and, one-upmanship and all this stuff of desire as you clear your mind of all thought through Zen practice and Zen meditation. I believe that's all that we have for Buddhism as far as material to cover, and so I'm going to have you in the next session watch a film on Buddhism.